Thank you for joining me. Dating back to its foundation, the U.S. public education system has perpetuated injustice and inequity on both students of color and students with disabilities. While lawmakers have removed the overtly exclusionary statutes that allowed legal segregation by race or ability, injustice remains in schools today. For example, when lawmakers banned school segregation during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, special education became the workaround to maintain exclusionary and discriminatory practices in schools. The way that teachers engage with disability and race in their classroom links to their underlying belief systems. Unfortunately, substantial evidence connects teacher beliefs and perceptions to the reification of hegemonic norms, which upholds barriers for students in educational settings. One contributing factor is a systemic incongruence between teachers and students. Specifically, the teacher workforce is overwhelmingly white and able-bodied. Likewise, scholars argue that those leading pre-service teacher education programs continue to ignore systemic inequities and teachers' roles in perpetuating them. Today, Black students continue to be 3 times more likely to be labeled in need of special education services than their white peers, but almost always in a subjectively decided category, such as a learning disability or emotional impairment, rather than a category with more objectively or readily apparent diagnostic criteria, such as visual or hearing impairments. Furthermore, elementary students with disabilities, while legally afforded the right to the least restrictive environment, are often only included with their general education peers in so-called enrichment classes, such as music and art, or when it is convenient for the school or teacher's schedule. Critical disability studies scholars argue that race and disability are simultaneously co-constructed and interdependent, intersecting in ways that make considering one without the other both impossible and unethical. While neither systemic racism nor ableism have to define teacher interactions with students, they are pervasive in our culture, educational structures, and society. Therefore, teachers must make conscious efforts to disrupt these narratives in their spheres of influence. Operating under this paradigm, scholars must consider the impact of the intersection of disability and race in music education spaces as well. Elementary general music may be an important place to study this intersection. Considering the racial and ethnic diversity of the PK-12 school system, and the fact that approximately 14% of students across the United States have an identified special education need, elementary music educators will likely encounter students with a variety of identity characteristics. Music educators often provide the first inclusion site for students with disabilities at the elementary level. And additionally, there doesn't appear to be a racial disparity regarding student access to music at the elementary level, as nearly all elementary children do receive musical instruction. However, BBIA students and students with disabilities remain severely underrepresented in secondary music, especially in instrumental ensembles such as band and orchestra. And the disparity is significantly higher for African American and Latinx students than for white students and other non-white populations. Furthermore, there's only minimal research on inclusion for students with disabilities in secondary ensembles. While Elpis and Abril posited various reasons for this disparity at the secondary level, including lack of access, appeal, or familial support, one other possibility might be a lack of attention to elementary teacher biases and praxis surrounding race, ability, and the intersection of the two. Therefore, educators who teach and potentially impact the lives of all the children in the building have the responsibility to critically examine their beliefs, structures, pedagogies, in order to create more equitable and inclusive spaces for all. Therefore, the purpose of this descriptive collective case study was to examine a music educator collaborative teacher study group, known as the CTSG, focused on exploring and unpacking narratives of race and disability in music education. My research questions were, how do teachers conceptualize issues of race and ability in both their belief systems and described classroom practices? How, if at all, did participants' beliefs about race and ability change as a result of participation in the CTSG? And what conditions within the CTSG facilitated any changes in mindset or behavior for participants? I designed and completed a descriptive collective case study of a collaborative teacher study group that examined the experiences of 8 music educators across the United States. Participants were 8 public school music educators who varied in age, teaching experience and assignment, personal identity characteristics, and geographic locations. Participants met via Zoom 11 times from July to December 2021 to share stories, discuss assigned readings, participate in activities, and collaborate on lesson plans. The overarching goal of the group was to uncover ways that racism and ableism operated in their personal and professional lives. Throughout the study, participants completed 3 individual interviews, beginning, midpoint, and ending, took turns leading group sessions, participated in a private social media page, and wrote in an online journal. I used transcripts of all of these as well as my analytic memos as data. I utilized 2 frameworks. First, DISCRIT, which is disability critical race theory, and TLP, transformative learning processes. Both of these were used to inform design, participant interactions, as well as to analyze data. I'm going to summarize my findings through each one of the research questions. First, initial stated beliefs and self-described teaching practices for these participants. Participants varied in their stated beliefs and classroom practices at the beginning of the study, and they displayed a continuum of commitment, both in their prior experiences and their stated participation goals. Some had spent considerable time before joining the CTSG learning about one construct, race or ability, as it related to their personal life, beliefs, or teaching. However, no participant had in-depth knowledge in both areas, and none had previously considered the intersection between race and ability and how that might be operationalizing in their teaching or thinking. At the outset of the study, some viewed it as important work that they were committed to doing, while others made excuses and offered justification, seeking absolution from me or expressing emotions such as fear and helplessness. Participants also displayed a broad spectrum of agreements and dissonances between their words and their actions. When participants' words and actions aligned, they were embracing growth and were eager to utilize strategies. But when their words and actions did not align, participants struggled with navigating through white fragility or used deficit language. And sometimes their words and actions alignment or misalignment would shift based on the topic, whether it was race or disability. Finally, participants varied greatly in their self-awareness, both about how their words and actions aligned or misaligned, and about the ways that they conceptualize topics of race and disability, both in music education as a whole and in their described teaching practices. By the end of the study, participants described and demonstrated several salient changes resulting from being a part of the CTSG. First, participants demonstrated that they were becoming more aware. In addition to increasing conceptual knowledge about race and ability and the ways the constructs operate and intersect in school music, participants spent considerable time rethinking experiences from their past to interrogate their own biases, the impact their biases had on their teaching, and they practiced noticing. They started to notice the ways that racism and ableism were operating, both in CTSG meetings and in their daily lives. They increased their vocabularies by defining confusing terms and noticing deficit language in themselves and others. They worked to acknowledge challenging feelings and started naming fault lines they saw in the educational system. Most importantly, they began to notice how the constructs of race and ability were manifesting in their music classrooms. Indeed, participants highlighted the importance of representation and about being intentional about inclusivity as primary changes to their thinking and stated classroom practices. For some, these were new discoveries, but for others, it was a reaffirmation or a growth in perspective. Because each participant started in different places and therefore different parts were new to each one, no one was completely unaware at the outset, and everyone grew in unique and different ways. Participants also reported that the CTSG had lit a spark for them for continued discovery, reflection, and action. They described feeling braver, more willing to ask tough questions of themselves and others. Some participants reported making new realizations about prior thinking and behavior and developed new conceptual knowledge about how race and ability intersected and operated in the music room. Some participants set personal and professional goals for themselves, such as creating allyship in their classroom or revamping their curriculum through a UDL lens. Others even began to take action, creating an equity committee at their school, removing a barrier to student learning, or speaking out to family and friends instead of remaining silent when they witnessed deficit language or problematic thinking. One of the primary goals of the study, though, was to create an environment that facilitated changes in participants' mindsets and behavior, and to consider how we might set up such an environment again. Several conditions proved salient for participants feeling that they were able to change. Participants built connections with other music educators, and they combated their self-declared isolation often, expressing joy about being in a group of people who understood. They expressed appreciation for both content and context-specific feedback on their teaching. And after building a sense of safety with each other, they began to become vulnerable and brave as they encountered discomfort in the meetings. They sought to challenge their thinking and teaching practices through new lenses, and they expressed greater confidence moving forward as a result of this discomfort. Participants connected through their shared desire to learn, as they all volunteered and to be in the CTSG with full knowledge of the topics ahead of time. No one felt forced to be in the CTSG, and as a result, they were intrinsically motivated to learn, which contributed to the development of connections amongst participants. Other conditions that contributed to change were emotional intensity, being vulnerable and brave, and sharing stories of their classroom teaching and lesson plans that they felt had not gone well. Each of them opened themselves up to feedback, responded to each other with supportive suggestions, and this contributed to a cycle of greater vulnerability and bravery. Furthermore, participants shared that they recognized the necessity of being uncomfortable, and they began to embrace ambiguity. They began to make the connection that they not only had to be uncomfortable in the group to grow, but they had to be willing to be uncomfortable in their daily lives to affect change in their own spheres of influence. Many began to stop looking for a specific algorithmic answer and instead embraced the idea that constructs like race and disability are complex, personal, situational, and there is no single right answer. They began to embrace the messiness of this work. Within the group, this messiness included moments where participants would sometimes fall back into a safe zone with their language or behavior, but as the group progressed, these moments became less and less frequent. Another necessary condition for change was the space to grapple with complex material. Participants grappled internally as well as with others. And when they were working with each other, they got to practice challenging conversations, which for many of them was something they had never done before. This process in turn increased their confidence to have a challenging conversation with someone outside the CTSG. The participants expressed having space to engage in these conversations, which directly resulted from the CTSG structure. Structures created safety while leaving room for discomfort and growth, and participants were collaborative in the CTSG. They were given time to reflect between meetings, try things out with their students, and report back on successes and failures. There were several salient considerations that emerged from all of the findings. The first one is that strategies and tools do exist. Participants often began the study by telling me they were looking for, quote, strategies or tools that they could use in their classroom to better serve students with disabilities and their BBIA students. By the end of the study, though, most participants expressed they felt more confident or that they had more skills to use. However, some still said they were, quote, looking for more practical steps, end quote. This mirrored some research where some claim that music education remains, quote, short on pedagogical tools, end quote. But music education is not short on pedagogical tools in the form of recommended practice. They're more available than they ever have been. However, music education is short on research that investigates the effectiveness of said tools. Within the small number of existing studies, small group sizes, and the paucity of replication studies, music education researchers lack sufficient evidence to make claims that would qualify strategies as, quote, evidence-based, and thus would be appropriate for teachers to use to support learners, especially those with special education needs. Evaluating effectiveness also necessitates us circling back to clarify what we mean when we use the phrase inclusion, especially for our students with disabilities. In 2012, Dobbs argued that many teachers might still be embracing therapeutic epistemologies related to the medical model in their teaching practice. For example, when music educators refer to students with disabilities in ways that imply a functional deficit and seek to mitigate these deficits through normative standards, they are reinscribing a medical model despite the appearance of inclusivity. If teachers believe that music is inherently therapeutic, this will affect how educators interact with recommended best practices for inclusion. And additionally, deficit approaches to inclusion may determine how a researcher might measure effectiveness of said inclusion. If a therapeutic or deficit mindset leads in decision-making about how, when, or why a child is included, then educators might measure effectiveness in terms of numbers of students with access to the space, without regard for the quality of experience or musical progress based on an intervention strategy. If educators and researchers conceive of disability from a social model, however, they would not focus on the number of students with access, but they might instead question what constitutes a pedagogy of inclusion and measure effectiveness through shifts in classroom culture, representation, teacher self-described mindsets, and student empowerment. If music educators began to conceptualize disability as multifaceted and potentially a source of strength, they might operate from a place where they believe every child could learn and grow musically and would be more comfortable setting musical learning goals they could include on an IEP. I argue that the conversation around strategies and tools for inclusion needs to shift. The tools exist even if we don't have the research evidence as robust as we might desire. Instead of lamenting the perfect set of solutions, educators and scholars might shift the conversation towards building teacher awareness about what strategies and resources are readily available. Teachers and researchers have the responsibility to do the necessary work to seek out all the ways people are already supporting students with disabilities and BBIA students in a music classroom. The responsibility surrounding awareness, though, does not fall solely to the practicing music educator. Preparation programs must take responsibility as well for making sure that teachers enter the field with knowledge of availability as well as how to access these tools, and they need to understand laws, funding structures, and resources for continued in-service education. Pre-service programs need to thoughtfully craft educational experiences that challenge normative messages about who or what belongs in musical spaces. And current in-service teachers need ongoing education beyond their pre-service experience. Professional development organizers and educational stakeholders at all levels need to consider how to offer this education that is both content specific to music educators and responsive to today's K-12 students. Related, those who facilitate PD also need to be responsive to the specific needs of the community they're working in and avoid prescriptive PD that teachers might struggle to contextualize to their classroom. They should prioritize finding ways to support teachers in centering the voices and musics reflected in the students that they teach. Music education is currently at a crossroads. The US student population is increasingly more diverse, and as such, so are their needs. However, practicing teachers cannot rely solely on the education they received in their pre-service coursework, or in many cases did not receive, in order to adequately support students in this ever-changing landscape of education. Many teachers did not and do not receive enough education on working with students with disabilities or with racially diverse populations. Indeed, music educators need more guidance to provide equitable learning opportunities for all students, especially for BBIA students and students with disabilities. Educators need to seek out additional learning, often in the form of PD, to supplement their knowledge. While one semester may not have been enough for these participants to bring about systemic or structural change, it did open the door to ask, what if? What is possible if teachers are willing to reconsider what they thought they knew about themselves and their teaching? And it's in this space of possibility that music educators have great potential to create change. Music can and should be a space where children, especially those who often find themselves at the margins of society, are welcomed and accepted. However, this requires intentional effort on the part of the educator to interrogate their own biases, fill gaps in their knowledge, and be willing to embrace different ways of teaching that center students' lived experiences, listen to their voices, and value what they bring to the musical space. Professional development through a CTSD is just one way that music educators might engage in the challenging work of interrogating mindsets and behavior to enact a more equitable teaching practice for all students. Thank you.